Professor Richard Falk, thank you so very much for joining our interview series.
It's my pleasure.
Let me start right away with the first question. You were among the signatories of the recent declaration warning of the return of fascism. In your view, how does the current resurgence of authoritarian nationalist politics differ in structure, aesthetic, and operational logic from the classical 20th century fascism? Can we still meaningfully use the term fascism across such divergent historical contexts without diminishing its analytical precision?
That's a very tough starting question and requires a good deal of reflection and nuance to do justice to it. It's important, of course, a crucial question. I mean, one of the striking differences is that the resurgence of especially autocratic tendencies in the West are less focused on internal class relations than they are on the threats of migration and immigration and the outsider rather than the enemy inside, which was a feature particularly of Nazi is the Nazi version of fascism. But generally, the struggles in Italy and France, Italy and Spain, that resulted in fascist emergence as dominant forces were essentially internal in their vital strategy. And furthermore, I think there was a different technological environment in the period of the early decades of the 20th century than what exists currently. And the forms of control and resistance are really radically different, I think, in the present world's situation due to this, the innovative technology that we group under the phrase digital age. But the core features of militarism and single charismatic leader that exert control over the political space and do not respect divergent views. I think that feature is present, and also the resistance of the state to dissent and protest is also characteristic of this new wave of far-right politics. Whether it's useful to connect this current wave with the problems that were underlay World War II is something that needs exploration and debate. I've sometimes referred to the situation in my country, the US, as experiencing what I call a Weimar moment. That is where you have a democratic superstructure and a liberal opposition, but it's weak and unable to really mount effective resistance to a rising ultra-right political formation. And it takes advantage of crises in the domestic economy and in the success or failure of state undertakings, but it's essentially concerned with a monopolizing of political power and economic influence and control. And in that sense, there is a continuity between the, and I think that German and Spanish versions of fascism particularly stress this alliance between the state and the military. And in the Spanish case, you had the Catholic Church. It was there was a kind of anti-communist element in the struggle. And I don't know as much about the Italian political atmosphere accompanying the rise of Mussolini, but I think there was also a far left division in the country, a polarization in the country. And so each of these fascist narratives of the past has its own originality and characteristics. And in one sense, even grouping them together may be questionable because it overlooks those differences. So on balance, I think it's useful to warn of the advent of a new phase in the experience of liberal democracies with fascist movements, but it's, I think, not helpful in the sense that it homogenizes what is essentially heterogeneous. In other words, the situation in the US is quite different situation in the major European countries, and certainly in some of the important global South countries, such as India and in its way, China and Russia, which fall outside the normal conception of where this new wave of fascism is threatening, although they have some shared characteristics, including a kind of one-person rule and a surveillance of the population to stigmatize dissent and protest, a search to totalize the political space under the authority of the coalition of economic elites and political leaders.
Right, right, Professor. The declaration warns of techno-fascist enthusiasts. How do you interpret the convergence of surveillance capitalism, algorithmic governance, and digital disinformation ecosystems with authoritarian statecraft? Are we witnessing the emergence of a new modality of domination, a digital totalitarianism beyond Orwellian metaphors?
I think that's a threat. Whether it will materialize in that kind of absolutist form is not yet clear or certain. We're at a period, I believe, of transition in which resistance and even a reversal of these tendencies remains a possibility. In other words, I don't think we're predetermined at this stage to have that future, though there are alarming signs that that's where the major liberal democracies are headed, and some of the more organized autocratic societies are already more or less arrived at those points. And I would mention India, China, and Russia as being very well organized to deal with a kind of techno-authoritarianism that in the Chinese case produces some pretty impressive results for its population. And is not war-prone in the way that fascism is usually portrayed. So it may be, again, too misleading to group autocratic tendencies in various states in one category.
Right.
And because the originality of the Chinese path is quite notable and seems to have some advantages as compared to the liberal democratic path.
Right. A century after the manifesto of the anti-fascist intellectuals in 1925, what enduring ethical and strategic lessons can today's democratic societies extract from those who risked everything to confront fascism at its inception? Are there analogs today to the cultural complicity and intellectual appeasement that enabled fascist ascendancy then?
Yes, I think, again, speaking first about the United States that I know best, there's definitely that similarity of a weak liberal opposition and a very impassioned autocratic, fascistic movement that has very dedicated conceptions of what it wants to achieve. Trump came to his second presidential term with a very worked out plan or blueprint of how to govern in light of the acceptance of this autocratic, authoritarian, anti-democratic set of aspirations. And he seems to have, at least temporarily, neutralized the economic oligarchs by having them, for opportunistic reasons, join with his MAGA movement. And that does suggest a drift toward this kind of consolidated authoritarian governance structure. There are some glimmers of light that suggest it may not be so simplistic to fulfill these autocratic ambitions. One of the glimmers of light was the outcome in New York City of this race to become mayor, which surprised most Americans and even most New Yorkers by selecting by an impressive margin the Muslim son of a mixed parental background, a self-proclaimed democratic socialist who seemed to defy all the traditional biases that were associated with the drift to the ultra-right. And it's at least being welcomed in the US as a warning to the Democratic establishment that they better get their oppositional act together or they'll be bypassed by this more progressive alternative politics. I happen to know the parents of Zorhan Mamdani quite well, and it's very thrilling for people who had these progressive hopes.
Right. In a political landscape defined by polarization, truth decay, and performative resistance, what forms of civic defiance remain normatively defensible and strategically viable? Is there still space for what you have elsewhere called normative resistance within a structurally degraded public sphere?
Well, it's a very interesting question. I mean, there are contradictory tendencies. There is a determined effort to close that space, and a general feeling that the project of the ultra-right is incompatible with a knowledge-based politics. And part of its characteristic, and it's, I think, in this sense, there's continuity with the earlier fascist movements. It prefers to mobilize people by emotional and belief-based arguments that are not interested in empirical truth. And for that reason, it's not surprising that in this country, the leading universities become primary targets of this ultra-right elite project. And it's also not entirely surprising that it pursues a very nationalistic agenda at the same time as it tries to withdraw from internationalism of the sort embodied in the UN or in cooperative problem solving, as in context of climate change and other global challenges. So one has a kind of contradictory format within which these political tendencies are being not resolved, but are in increasing tension. And the issues surrounding this very harsh treatment of undocumented immigrants that are vital to the economy bring some of these contradictions to the surface, because, and even Trump has had to back off from implementing the anti-immigration policies when it comes to farm workers and the staffing of restaurants and domains where undocumented immigrants were vital and probably not easily replaced.
Right, right, Professor. You have long emphasized the dangers of soft authoritarianism embedded within liberal orders. From Modi to Erdoğan, Netanyahu to Trump, do you regard contemporary populist authoritarianism as a transitional phase toward a more explicit fascist ethos, or does it represent a distinct ideological mutation altogether?
Well, again, that's a very hard question, which requires a clearer crystal ball than one in my possession. In other words, it can go either way or both ways, and differently in different places. I think one of the interesting recent developments is the normalization of the language of genocide as applied to Israel's violence in Gaza. It still is a prohibited terminology on the part of the government supporting Israel, and it's used selectively as a way of punishing protesters, but still within the society as at large, that terminology, the naming of the violence, it's no longer abnormal or extreme to refer to it as genocide or to refer to the pre-October 7th situation as apartheid. And that represents a victory of sorts for those that want a truth-based way of governance, truth-based mode of governance, which is associated, I think, with liberalism, the tradition of the Enlightenment, and the whole role of science. So you have this peculiar attitude of the ultra-right, which on the one side is very, uses instrumentally this technology of what you call the politics of surveillance, or a kind of fascist variant of a politics of surveillance. And on the other side is very unsupportive of scientific research, technological innovation, and really of knowledge acquisition within leading centers of learning, and the hostility, for instance, to foreign students that is taking hold here, which is one of the attempts of the Trump presidency, is emblematic of this tendency.
Right, right. Your scholarship on global capitalism critiques the deep structural inequalities produced by neoliberal orthodoxy. How do you see these economic dislocations, especially the evisceration of public goods, precaritization of labor, and austerity, as constituting fertile ground for authoritarian populist narratives and politics of resentment?
Well, I think it has created those fertile grounds, and Trump and others in the world have known how to take advantage of them to really win support from those elements of society that are most victimized by this, what I call predatory capitalism, and that is very exploitative toward vulnerable sectors of society, and very conducive to the growing inequalities between a tiny number of successful entrepreneurial individuals and at the same time very harshly fiscally stingy toward the vulnerable people toward the bottom of the economic scale. And that solidifies this growing polarization of a class-based orientation. But it also creates alienation and resentment that's effectively mobilized by a belief-driven kind of strong leader of the sort that Trump represents, or Modi, or Erdoğan, the names you mentioned.
Right. Can the anti-fascist imperative itself become captive to ideological co-optation or instrumentalization? How can progressive actors preserve the ethical clarity of anti-fascist struggle without succumbing to partisan reductionism or performative moralism?
Well, of course, that remains to be seen how strong they are. I have not much confidence in the liberal wing of the political spectrum that is represented by here by the Democratic Party and elsewhere, for instance, in the UK by the Labour Party, and those that accept the structure of capitalism and and nationalism tend not to have the political will to maintain resistance in the face of strong repressive policies. And that creates my fear that these autocratic, fascistic movements will test the resilience of the political system, and the resistance will depend on a surge of affiliation and commitment to what I call the progressive portions of the society that are outside the framework of the bipartisan political structures that dominate most sovereign states.
Right. In the light of Israel's recent military operations in Gaza and the structural conditions of Palestinian dispossession, how would you assess the extent to which settler colonial regimes today deploy fascistic methods under the rubric of democratic self-defense or counterterrorism?
Well, it really depends on whether you consider Israel an anomaly or something more menacing globally as part of this regressive trend. I tend to view them as an anomaly because of the additional influence of Zionist ideology added on to the settler project. And that gives it a dehumanizing focus on dominating the other in the name of racial supremacy. And that's why a Zionist state like Israel turns into an apartheid. The resident population as a persecuted presence in their own homeland. And it's really a repetition of the story of settler colonialism in the white breakaway British colonies of North America, Australia, New Zealand, where again, apartheid practices gave way to the embrace of a genocidal strategy. And in order to achieve the ends of a purified ethnic hierarchy that completely marginalizes the native population.
Right.
But I don't see that happening beyond Israel, in quite certainly not in as crude a form. You have some of it in India with the treatment of Muslims by the Hindu nationalist orientation of the Modi government, and especially in Kashmir, where many of these same tendencies are evident. But I don't find it a general characteristic.
Right. And lastly, Professor Falk, you have consistently critiqued the asymmetries of global governance. Does the international community's paralysis in the face of enduring Palestinian suffering reflect not only political hypocrisy, but a deeper erosion of the normative foundations of international law itself?
Yes, I'm guilty of all those things. And I think the comparison between the Western reaction to the Russian attack on Ukraine and its reaction to Israel's behavior in Gaza and the West Bank is illustrative of using international law and the UN as a sword against enemies while using international law and the UN as a shield against a shield protecting friends, or so you have complete double standards between how law is working when you're dealing with an adversary and how law works when you're dealing with your own behavior or that of your close allies. And you have that dualism in the reaction on the one side to Ukraine, where the impassioned appeals to the UN, to the International Criminal Court, and Israel, where the UN was denounced and International Criminal Court was repudiated when it issued these arrest warrants. So it undermines law as a regulative framework that governs behavior into a policy instrument with inconsistent use for friends and enemies.
Professor Falk, thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Your questions were very sophisticated, and I was glad to try my best to respond to them.
Thank you so much.
Good. Good to see you and to be with you.